Y'all, I am still excited from the party that we just had outside with the Mocha Jumbies. So I want to thank them. And if are they in the room anywhere? The performers? Okay, when they come here, y'all, we got to give them a round of applause. But I want to do it one more time right here. Let's give the Mocha Jumbies a round of applause. I didn't do the limbo myself, but I did think about it. My name is Clint Fluker again, and I am so excited to be here with Vaughn Belle, who is just an incredible artist and someone who is just become a friend over this period of time. And I'm grateful to spend this time with you in this way. Because we're being recorded, I can't help myself. I got to thank a lot of people. All right. First and foremost, I want to thank the Virgin Islands Studies Collective. We've mentioned them before, but I want to say their names one more time for really making this possible. I want to thank, of course, our own here at Emory, Tiffany Yannick, Tammy Navarro, and of course, Hadia Sewer, and then, of course, the Vaughn Belle one more time for really making this the event that it has been throughout the full day. I want to thank Vice Provost Valita Dent and Dean Barbara Krotheimer for making the funds available so that we could do this. I also want to thank the people who organize all of the exhibition-oriented aspects of this project, which there were really two exhibits. There was the exhibit here, which we're going to talk about in depth, Come Ruin or Come Rapture. And then there was the exhibit at Clark Atlanta Museum, which was A Haunting Between Us. So I want to thank Elizabeth Horner and Henry Kim for spearheading the work here at the Carlos, as well as the education and communications teams with Katie Erickson, Emily Knight, and Shannon Clute. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the exhibitions team, who were just so thorough in their work. And my good friend now, Registrar Todd Lampkin. Let's give him a little shout out. He's in the back. Come on, man, raise your hand. Let him see. We've had some wonderful grad students, we mentioned them a little bit earlier, who have not only introduced us, but have also been intimately involved in the planning of the event, the exhibitions, and the symposium of Decolonial Feelin. So before I start really asking questions and kind of getting into depth here, I also wanted to give Vaughn Belle a chance to say a few words.
Thank you so much for being here. I also wanted to extend some gratitude first and foremost to my fellow VISCO members. It's been really one of the great joys of my life to be in conversation with you women. And of course, to give a special thanks also to Tiffany for creating this space and requesting that I exhibit here. And thank you so much to the Carlos for accepting her request. And of course, as Clint has already mentioned, there were so many people, from the director to the curators to the installers to the graphic designers, the educational team, to Todd, who helped me figure out how to send a very, very fragile sculpture here from St. Croix for the first time. I really appreciate all of the effort, the care, and support. And I want to also give a very special thanks to Clint, who has been an incredible collaborative partner throughout this journey. It's been a joy, and I've been enriched so much to get to know you better. And, a lot of people may not understand the curatorial relationship between artist and curator, but it's, someone who's really deeply thinking about your work and looking at your work and kind of, the pieces that you selected for this show, it enriches my own knowledge of my own practice in such incredible ways. So I'm really, really grateful to continue this conversation today with you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So I have some tough questions for Vaughn. We're going to get started. I'm just playing. No. I really wanted to start this conversation today by going through a few themes, and then after we're done, we will make it available so that y'all can ask questions afterwards. For sure, but we'll start really with some of your background. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if we could start with the fact that you were born in Trinidad and Tobago, and at an early age, your family moved to the Virgin Islands, and that's where you still reside. And so much of your work deals with this idea of unpacking and questioning colonialism. And I was wondering if you could speak about your family's move and its effect it has had on your view of the concept of citizenship from that early age.
Thank you for that question. So my father was a Moravian priest, and the Moravian Church is one of those missionary churches that came to the Caribbean to literally make slavery more palatable for African people. And my father and my mother actually grew up in small village churches in their respective islands. And my father was one of that first generation of Black men that became ministers. And so in the Moravian missionary tradition, they move you. So he met my mother. He was from Barbados. He met my mother in Tobago. And then shortly after my birth, we moved to St. Thomas first. So I lived in St. Thomas and then St. Croix. But what that means is that like the lineage of my family is literally embedded in that colonial project. That missionizing Christian project is how I came to be a Virgin Islander. But what's also interesting is that I was born with my political rights intact in Trinidad and Tobago and lost them when I moved to the Virgin Islands and became something between a subject and a citizen. Because that's kind of what Virgin Islanders experience, where you are part of the United States, but not fully. And so, especially when I did my studies in Cuba, they had such a big and over sense of their nationhood. It really caused me to reflect a lot on my own. And so I've thought a lot about what that means to be a Virgin Islander. I mean, I always grew up, when people would hear, oh, you were born in Trinidad and Tobago, they're like, oh, you were born on a plane? You were born like how? So I've definitely experienced that growing up, my life constantly being questioned about my Virgin Islanderness. So I think it's something that, of course, shows up in my work.
So as you kind of go through what's this description of this, you're analyzing citizenship and your relationship to where you're born and where you moved. I'm wondering about your early experiences when it comes to art and why you chose to be an artist. And you mentioned Cuba, so I'm going to go back to that later. But I'm really interested in those early experiences. Like, why was art what you chose to express these thoughts?
Well, I had the same art teacher from 7 years old to 17. And my father had commissioned him to reimagine the Stations of the Cross, St. Peter, which was the church that he had when he became Anglican. He switched to the Anglican church. And Jesus himself to be brown-skinned Black people like us. And he was doing that commission in our classroom. So when I would go to art class at 2-3 times a week, I would watch my teacher reimagine this very ancient archive and biblical story. And I saw, how he developed from the sketches all the way up. And I think that was one of the first times that I realized the power of how art could transform stories, especially the ones that we needed. And he always encouraged me to be an artist. And I, like the rebellious preacher's kid that I was like, nah, I'm not going to be an artist. But eventually I succumbed to my calling. And I first thought that I went to Columbia actually to pre-med, and then decided I wanted to be a writer, and then decided I would be a different kind of storyteller as a visual artist.
And you spent some time as a teacher as well.
I did.
Right? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I did Teach for America in the South Bronx. So I worked in the South Bronx for about 3 years being a teacher. And that, of course, I mean, all of those experiences impact the work that I make now. I think, a liberal arts degree definitely gives you just an expansive way of thinking, especially, I did literature and sociology, and then I did teaching and curriculum design, and all of those things are very narrative-based, but it helps you also think through the societies and how they construct themselves and how knowledge is constructed. So that's kind of my background, and you see that very much in the way that I make my work.
And I recall also you were saying that you were doing Teach for America, and so you had this teaching background, but this also led you to Cuba somehow, and this is where you were formally trained in art. Could you speak to that experience?
Yeah. So when I moved back to the Virgin Islands, most of you may be too young to remember Y2K, but at the turn of the millennium, we thought that things would crash when things went to 2000. And so I left Babylon quick and fast to go back home to become an artist. And then shortly after, I started teaching at the University of the Virgin Islands, a humanities course, a Caribbean humanities course. I knew a lot about music, I knew a lot about dance, I knew a lot about visual arts, but I didn't know a lot about Caribbean film or theater. And so that research led me to discovering this amazing multidisciplinary art school in Havana. And I went there for a summer in 2001, and then 6 months later, moved there indefinitely to pursue getting a master's degree. And that experience transformed my life. I met my husband, who was my husband, who would become my husband. I met him there, not my ex-husband, just to clarify. But
we had to talk about that.
Just to get the narrative straight. I had the adventure of a lifetime. But what I think some of the things that impacted me definitely in the way that I make my work is Cuba is not a place of free speech. We used to have inspectors that would come to check our studios to make sure we were not making work that was counter-revolutionary. And so like many Cuban artists, I learned how to create many layers of meaning in my work to evade censorship or punishment. And that is very much present in the work that I make today, that strategy of doing that. As well as I did a performance art program that got us to very, very expansive in the ways that we thought about making in terms of, it was very multidisciplinary. So one day I would be making a video, the next day I'm like doing a socially engaged project with people in the barrio. And, it was a very, it just completely opened up. I was a painter when I went to Cuba, but it totally expanded the way that I think about art making.
So, y'all, I want to move us into talking about the exhibit that is actually downstairs, Come Ruin or Come Rapture. And if you haven't seen it already, please take some time to kind of immerse yourself in this exhibition. It's filled with just incredible pieces that really transform the Works on Paper gallery in a way that I really haven't seen yet. What I wanted to ask you, Vaughn, about this was, while we were selecting pieces for this exhibit, we were kind of playing with this idea that you came up with around the aesthetics of ruin. Mm-hmm. And I was really curious if you could speak to us about what you mean by that, and how this concept is represented through your work.
Okay. Well, first, I live on the island of St. Croix, which was cut up into over 150 plantations. And unlike like other places in the South where you drive to a plantation and it's something that you go to, we live in plantations. So our schools are in them, our churches are in them, our shopping centers. You see them you see remnants of them everywhere, which means that we literally live in the ruins of the plantation system. The great houses and the sugar mills are all visible, very, pretty much you can't miss them. They're everywhere. And so that's something, just like, what does that mean to live in that level of symbolic violence? But that's also kind of in various stages of ruin. So that's, I think, when I came back from Cuba, and I started thinking about like, how would I apply the techniques and the strategies that I learned? And I just looked outside. That was the first thing that I felt I wanted to respond to in my work. But then I also purchased, an abandoned building in about 2011 to convert it into a studio. It was in the historic district. And the process of renovating that building also transformed my thinking as an artist, because I didn't have a lot of money. So I did a lot of any work I could do myself, I did. And I renovated that. I mean, when you have a historic property, you always renovate in. But I was very intensely renovating to the point that I could use it for about 2 years, and I actually stopped making art. Or so I thought. In a way, that was an art project. The sweeping, the scraping, the caulking, the researching of all the previous owners, because it ended up being in this profoundly historic neighborhood that I didn't know much about. It was where the first people who found freedom during slavery, where they were relegated to live by law, so it was called Free Gut. And I developed this really intimate knowledge between the narratives and the materiality. The wood, the coral stones, the brick, the Cheney that I would find outside, which are shards of colonial era pottery. It was that. And so a lot of my work after purchasing that property and doing the renovation started really deeply engaging with the material artifacts from the colonial period, which are, they're all fragments and ruins and things like that. And so I started thinking a lot about how to reconstruct them and piece them together to tell new narratives. And so that you'll see recurrent in many parts of my practice, and especially in the work that's downstairs. Yeah.
And the work that's downstairs now, as you go through, you'll see there's these huge collages that just sort of take over the walls. And what's interesting about them to me is they have this great beauty, but learning the story behind where you started this particular project with the Storm series, coming out of Hurricane Maria in 2017, when your studio was affected by that. And you had ruined pieces, quote unquote, ruined pieces that you then were able to use and reconstruct this story, as you were saying.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how that changed over time, though, because you still produce work in this series, and how the materials that you're using now might have developed as you continue doing it.
Yes. So I first started working with this, what I call the Storm series, in 2015. And they started off as very small black and white graphic drawings with charcoal. And it was just this iconic image of a palm tree in a perpetual storm, like bent and, flailing. And then I graduated to there's one piece that you selected downstairs that was from the series, actually in the pandemic, which is starting in 2020. But of course, we had the devastating hurricanes in 2017. My studio was damaged. And what's interesting about that time is I actually was in Denmark. So I had a friend pack up a lot of my work, but some things that I thought were saved weren't. They were in plastic, like paper rolls. And a couple years later, when I went to try to use that paper, it had absorbed this atmosphere of the storm, because my studio, the roof had gone, and I was in Denmark. So I couldn't quite, after the storm, everything, I couldn't quite get to securing it. And then several months after, it was still kind of like that. So when I went to start to use the paper, it was brittle and it started to crack and rip when I unrolled it. And I almost threw that paper out until another friend and curator and art historian of mine, Michael Wilson, reminded me, but Lavon, your work is about archives. This is like an archive to the storm. So I found, which is very antithetical to how people typically use paper. Paper, when you're working with it, it's always like you want to keep it very pristine. You want to show that you're a mastery of it. It's almost like you want to keep the paper as pristine as possible when you're making a work. So for me to think about almost allowing the damage that had happened in the paper to be a part of it, and then maybe create my own, manipulate that in a way to really use paper in a different kind of way, it opened up a part of my practice. So I worked with the ripped papers, and I started using, color blocks and creating these images of the storm with charcoal and ink washes. And then first they were pretty much still in the black and white and grays. And then I started inserting a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of color. And then I really went for the color. And now you'll see, like in this one, I'm also not just pushing color, but also pushing the shapes and thinking about them in different kinds of ways. Like for me, they're kind of maps, but they're also starting to feel more like, I think there's one here, maybe the next one, that feels a little bit almost like, like there's human parts in it almost, or animal parts creeping out. Like it's starting to take on a different form. So we'll see where that goes. But yeah, this is a good example of the work as it's starting to shift.
And you also started putting in these sections that I hope people can see on the screen, where there's these little dots, and it comes from this Cuts and Burns series, which speaks to another question I have about your work with the archives. But could you talk about the Cuts and Burns series?
Yeah.
I have some images of that here, why you started including that in.
Yeah, so the historical renovation work that I was doing on my studio got me really, I would drive everywhere and it's like I'm noticing every detail in historical buildings now, like little, circular routing things that are on the beams and all these details. And I started to really understand the difference between Christiansted and Frederiksted. So our town has two twin towns that are named after Danish kings. And Frederiksted is the one that was burnt down during both of our major rebellions. And the second rebellion that happened in 1878, the Firebond, when Frederiksted was rebuilt, it had a very striking architectural detail that for me, I found so interesting how the history of the town of rebellion was embedded in the structures. That's how I started to see that. And so I started thinking about how could, as an artist, I develop a visuality around resistance? Because I'm seeing that there's a visuality in the buildings. Is there something I could start doing? And to kind of document this history in a way as another kind of archive gesture. So I started thinking about, well, how do people resist? And primarily in the Caribbean, they use two tools. They use the same cutlass or machete or cane bill that they labored with, which you may see many Virgin Islanders wear this. This has become kind of a symbol for us. And they also use fire. And so I thought about, and that cutting and burning is also indigenous people did it. The colonizers did it when they tore down the virgin forest. They slashed and burned them. And so that dual cutting and burning has, a history of usage and how to transform things. So I thought that was I found a tool. It was a woodworking tool, a pyrography tool, that if I found an industrial level one that I could crank all the way up and use that to both cut and burn in paper at the same time. When I do that work, I have to be very measured because if I'm a little careless, the paper will catch on fire. So that's also why the burns are so, and I've just developed a rhythm with it, because of course, it could look very different than these very measured. They almost look like seeds in a way. There are many different interpretations of the way that I'm doing it, but they're very measured in a way that I feel like it has a lot of layers to meaning, because the first time I showed this work, the curtain work, actually the woman who asked me this question, she was here today, was a friend of mine's mother. And she came up to me and she put her hand on my shoulder and she's like, "Are you okay?" And she asked me that. I knew exactly why she asked me that when she asked me. Because when you're very close to the work and you see the level of violence that's in it, it's very palatable. So she was like, "Why are you making work like this? It's so violent." I mean, it's beautiful work, but it's also super violent. She's like, "Are you processing? What's going on with you?" And truth be told, at that time, my mother was dying of Alzheimer's. And so, people also do cutting and burning on their skin. And so it was a way I was also registering that pain of loss of my mom. And at the time, I had 3 very young children. And so my studio time was very limited. And this work was the kind of work I could do really quickly. I could turn on the machine and go. I didn't have to mix paint. It was I could just go. And so if I only had half an hour to be in the studio, I can still make work. So that work came out of many layers of my life.
I could definitely see the themes of violence and beauty, but the first thing that came to mind when we were hanging this, the curtain is actually part of a haunting between us at Clark Atlanta University. The first thing I noticed was how delicate it is. And that delicacy, I think, kind of speaks volumes to this whole project. You see it from so many different angles, so many different layers, but even just hanging it was such you had to be so careful in order not to damage the little holes that go along with it. And just imagining you doing thousands of these over and over again, the soft touch that is necessary to make it happen.
I will say, though, that I started adding them into my Storm series, painting collages, based on a question. My current partner is an artist as well. And he'd asked me, my work is so multidisciplinary, and sometimes I feel it maybe looks a little schizophrenic. Like, how is this woman doing oil? But, like if you look at my website, I have a lot of different kinds of work. And he asked me, he said, well, what would it look like if all of the things you think about was in one thing? And that's how I also came to start making these painting collages. So for me, that's really kind of been a piece that all the things that I think about is really there. And so I started incorporating the cuts and burns because I realized that this work is almost also like a kind of map. And so I can kind of create these little sections that register. I mean, there are many layers. It could be like sections of marronage, sections of rebellion. Like there's all these many readings into that work.
The cuts and burns also creates a connection between the collection or the series that's in the exhibit here and the one that is at the Clark Atlanta Museum. And it really kind of starts when you move to the Swarm series. Mm-hmm. And this is one that really spoke to me because of my own formal training in archival curation. But really how you've combined this here, you've taken cuts and burns, and now you've also done something very special with archival images from the Royal Danish Archives.
Yeah.
And these pictures that you're using, these images, are featuring enslaved people from that period of Danish colonial rule. And I'm wondering at this point if you could discuss your process of how you did this research in the archive and how it kind of affected the work.
Yeah. I would just want to clarify that because these images are usually from the later 1800s, so this is after slavery, but the conditions are very similar. Well, first I will say that I'm not sure if that was mentioned very clearly in some of the workshops or previous, but I will say the Virgin Islands is a place that has had to develop collective memory without our formal archives. So when the Danes sold us to the United States, they took a lot of the records with them. And my very first trip to Denmark in 2008, someone invited me, a PhD student, to see what they were working on, which was albums of people who lived in the Danish West Indies, photo albums. I am so glad that I went to see it at the end of my trip. I was there for 3 months because I would have never left. Like as a Virgin Islander, seeing these images for the first time, it was so overwhelming. What was also overwhelming was the violence in the images. When you look at a lot of them, you'll realize that there's a particular narrative that's constructed in image, especially at this time. Remember, to make a photographic image takes several minutes. People have to, that's part of the reason they all look so stoic, is because they're standing there for a while the film develops. And so it's very, very staged. Who's in power, who's a servant. And oftentimes when Black people show up in these images, they're characterized like ordered property, land, and animals. They're very in the similar category. And when you look at them, there's like a violence that also imposes upon you as a viewer. Like the narratives in them impose upon you. So I had been starting to do some work previous to this project, trying to navigate that. It's one project is called How to Survive Colonial Nostalgia, where I take some of these images and I put them into, I repeat them to look like a eye, and then like a black hole. So it's almost like the evil eye that's supposed to repel a gaze. So it's kind of working with that double gaze. But when I made that work, I was dissatisfied immediately. I just felt like I wanted to go further. Like I really needed to go further. So I thought, I'm gonna actually work with the materiality of the image as a photograph. And I will be honest, when I first started, I was a little scared. Like you typically have a reverence for archival photographs. Like you're not supposed to really mess them up, So my first task was I just wanted to find a way to separate the Black bodies from the narrative. And so I thought I would cut and burn around them. And it was a very intuitive at first. I was like, okay, now there's some white bodies. What do I do with those? And I or maybe even like a bag that they had in their hand or a tool that they were using. And I just started to commit to the project. Like I was liberating them. So I was taking all of that other stuff out, and that it was hard. And it was like a psychic transgression. It was a cut in a way that I had to make. And I realized that so much of decoloniality is about having to learn how to make some of those psychic extractions, like some of those cuts that you had to make in your mind. That piece definitely taught me that when I was making them. And then as I continued, I started to see them as like, maybe another image will help. I started to see them as, one, that there was another side to the image. And I, when I'd hold it up and I make the cuts, it was like, wow, that's kind of beautiful, but I didn't quite know yet how to show it. Last year at the Halsey Institute, I had a solo exhibition. That was the first time I was able to find the right framing to show both sides. And then there's also other wonderful discoveries, like if it's lit correctly, you can see the specters and the haunting that goes onto the wall, which I find really interesting, and the shadows. But then, I started to see them, they reminded me of other natural forces that are destructive, like termites. And if you live in the Caribbean, it's always a thing with termites, right? You're just like, the termites. But termites are so essential also, because if we didn't have them, we would just have overgrown everything. They're such an essential part of our ecosystem, and they really do help transform to bring forth something new. And so I thought, that's where the title Swarm came from. But I think too, they also feel like bees. They could feel, someone also recently mentioned to me, they also feel like seeds. It's almost like seeds that are being thrown. So there's a lot of, I think, beautiful interpretations.
Sometime I'm going to skip around just a little bit. I'm sorry. I want to move to what I think is probably the showstopper when you come when you come to the exhibition at Clark. This piece, Sovereign, it's magical. It also is very dangerous because there's broken glass everywhere. And you can imagine we had grad students breaking glass in the basement, wearing masks.
I know. I did it to make it myself the first time. I know what it is. I had like microscopic cuts all over my face.
Oh my gosh. I appreciate you telling us the method first so we could protect ourselves. But this was really a special experience, not just witnessing the sculpture when it arrived, but also activating it, putting it together so that people could see it, surrounded by the images from Swarm. This sculpture, though, tells a story of rebellion. And I would love it if you could tell us more about that story that you're telling here.
It's a story, again, thinking through archives and reimagining them. We come to know the story of the first encounter of Christopher Columbus with the indigenous people of the island of St. Croix through the records of the people who were on that voyage. There's about 4 records that are typically used to narrate that story, and some of their memories are contradictory. But what we learn from them and can parse together is that there was a violent encounter between the indigenous Kalinago, who are also known as Caribs, and the Taino people that were also there. And so when Columbus arrived, they started to try to take some people back, because that's was part of their mission with the king. They were taking people back. And then another series of people came around the bend with a canoe and saw that they were doing that, and then fighting ensued. And when one of the canoes was overturned, people kind of leapt up and were still shooting arrows, and they killed 2 of Columbus's men. And we learned from the records that some of the people that were in the water were also women. And for me, I was an elite competitive swimmer when I was for about 15 years, from 8 to about early 20s. And so I know exactly what that skill is, to be able to swim and shoot arrows. That's real skill. And I just found that I actually learned that story doing a tour in the bay where it happened. And that bay is also very unique because it's one of the few places in the world that has this this natural, incredible phenomenon where there's a kind of plankton that grows in it that lights up like a bluish green at night. So when you put your hand in the water like this, you see it's almost like stars. So it's a magical place. And I found that interesting too, that how the nature also has its own natural defense systems, right? That it lights up as a form of defense. So when I was thinking through that first encounter narrative, I wanted to find a way to think through the story. So I started with, I wanted to use paper pulp because paper, of course, is part of my practice and it's part of, it's a kind of archive. And then I went to the site and I actually took some of the soil from the site and used that. And so it's like they're kind of infused in the work as well. And but then when I got to the arms, originally I envisioned that I thought I was actually going to do a literal spear and bow, and I just I was kind of trying, like, how do I do that? Because I'm trying to have it like it's emerging from the water, and then I realized I didn't need to do a literal spear and bow, and that actually kind of this idea that we've been thinking through as a group. Especially inspired by a lot of the work that Hadia's been doing with nature and humanity and coloniality, and the idea of nature almost as like a co-conspirator. I started thinking like, well, what if this figure kind of became something like of the natural environment as a form of defense, like a root tree or a branch or a mangrove. Like, what if they turned into that as an act of as a strategy of resistance? So that's kind of what I'm thinking through there. And then but the glass came after, and it's so interesting just how things come to you as an artist. The work was already in the exhibit, and maybe 2 days before the show I was dropping my daughter to school and there was a car accident, and there was a sea of glass on the road, and I went, aha. Like, that was because I had always still wanted to incorporate the bioluminescent bay, but I couldn't quite. I was trying to do it light. I even tried like glow in the dark. Everything looked cheesy. Everything looked horrible. I was like, okay, I can't figure this out. Next time, next iteration. But when I saw the broken glass on the street, I realized, and I thought it also just worked with the like ruptures of our histories. I mean, there's so many. Like, it's a very evocative metaphor, thinking about this sea of broken glass and mirrors and kind of the effects that it creates in the room. So I'm excited to pursue this work. I don't think this is the final iteration of it.
I have to say, just like seeing it in person just made me feel powerful. I don't know how else to describe it. As a Black person, just thinking about the story behind it, I just couldn't contain it. And it seems, like you said, magical, the term we're using. It seems like that because when you're there and you look at it, when the light comes down, like you said, you include the mirrors as well, it just refracts the light on the wall and the ceilings, and it's really something to behold. We don't have time to go through all the questions. I could talk to her all day, so I'm just going to do one more, and then I'm going to open it up to everyone else. We wanted to end by just sort of acknowledging how you describe your own work as creating new archives and redrawing colonial lines. And I wanted to ask you to speak more about some of your other mediums that you use to do this.
Yeah, so this is a video project that I did that was inspired. I was asked to do a project in Philly where they were asking 25 artists around the country to think about this one very critical question. is the sun rising or setting on the American project of democracy? And they asked the question in that way because in Philadelphia, that's where the Constitutional Convention was signed, and it comes out of this anecdotal story that George Washington had been sitting in a chair that had a carving of a sun with rays, and then Benjamin Franklin, who's the oldest member of the convention, he said at the end of the signing, he wasn't sure where things were going to go, but he was very happy, and he felt like now he could understand that the sun is rising on the American project after everything was signed. And I was the only artist that was invited that is from a colony of the United States. So that complicates this question of the American democracy project. And when you also think about the rising sun and its allusions to the manifest destiny and the sea to, the sea to shining sea, this kind of idea, the irony is that in St. Croix, the rising sun of the so-called United States is on St. Croix. We are the easternmost part of the United States. So I did a project where I wanted to film the sun, the sunset. And then in my research, I realized very quickly that place is called Point Udall. There's another Point Udall in the Pacific Ocean, in Guam, which is another colony of the United States. So this rising and setting sun of the U.S. empire is on these two island territories. And that video project is kind of, it's thinking through, it's me going to, filming the sunset, the sunrise, and then it's like a film essay narrative throughout. But Michael Bekwala is here. I met him when I went to Guam. And he is a very esteemed curator and decolonial thinker. And my film crew that I was with was like, "Oh, you're gonna meet him? He's so busy and how did you get to meet him?" And so when I met him in this diner in Guam, that's the first question I asked him. I said, everyone's talks so highly of you, and they said, "You're so busy. How come you met me?" And he said, "Because we were never meant to meet." And that line is actually in the film. And it was so true because it was like coloniality tries to divide us. It makes us think that we're so separate, so different. It makes us not even see each other. And so I think so much of the work that VISCO is doing, it's of course trying to make visible ourselves to each other, but we also really want to understand our fellow humans that are also in the struggle with us. And so, I'm really glad that Michael accepted our invitation to be in conversation here with us today. And we will continue, and that you also are a part of this conversation today, and that this conversation will continue.
Vaughn Belle, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.